Hello everybody! Today we're going to talk about factoring four-term polynomials. And today the method we were going to use to do this is we are going to use the grouping method. And with using this grouping method, we will group the given polynomial, use the grouping method to factor into two binomials. Now, I had previously used this method whenever I talked about factoring trinomials. So you may have seen this method before. If you chose to use a different method for factoring your polynomials, this method is new. So let's take a look at the steps for this method. Okay, so our steps for this method, first step is going to be to group the first two terms together and the last two terms together. And I will mention that when you do this, you want to have a plus sign between the groups. Okay, so let me demonstrate that in my example over here on the left. Or the right, sorry, that's the right. So grouping this together, the first two terms, it would be x cubed plus 3x squared, plus sign in between because you're going to group the other two terms together, 2x plus 6. So group the first two terms together, group the last two terms together with the plus sign in between. The purpose of grouping these together is because if you look at each group, in each group, you have a GCF, and that's going to be our next step. Our next step is going to be to factor out the GCF from each binomial. So what that's going to look like here for us is in the first grouping, we can see that there is a GCF of x squared. Now, you should be able to factor that out in your head, but in case you are not able to do that, you can, put a little note underneath what you're dividing by, and that might help clear up what you get after you have divided that out. So here's what you're left with there. For the second one, I'll factor out my GCF in my head. It's a GCF of 2, leaving you behind with an x plus 3. Okay? After you factor out the GCF, okay, you should get the identical parentheses. If you do not, then something's gone wrong. Either they were grouped wrong at the beginning or your GCFs were wrong. So those are some things to look at. All right, the next step that you're going to do is you're actually going to factor out that common parenthesis. So think of this as group 1 and this as group 2. In each of those groups, there is a common parenthesis. And we can see where that common parenthesis is this and this. So what we're going to do with that is we are going to factor it out. So next step is going to be factor out the common binomial. So after we factor out the common binomial, it'll look like this. And then what we have left after we factor it out, so if we imagine we take out what's highlighted in green, if you take that out of each group, so any GCF goes out to the front of a parenthesis, and what's left behind are the GCFs. So you factor out the common parenthesis, and your GCFs make the second binomial in your factored form. Okay? If you wanted to check your answer, again, you don't have to check your answer. Okay, but if you did, you would just check your answer by multiplying using either using the FOIL method, multiple distribution method, any of those will work. Okay, so this one here is going to be your final answer. Now let's take a moment and do another example without the steps being written off to the side for you. Okay? All right, so let's begin by grouping the first two terms together, grouping the second two terms together, and putting a plus sign in between. Okay, let's go over the first example here. So in the first example, you are going to group the first two terms together. You're going to group the second two terms together, and then you're going to put a plus sign in between. Okay, so my next step is I'm going to take out the GCF from each of the groups. So in the first group, I can see that they have a 2 in common, and they have an A in common. So that means I'm going to take out from the parentheses a 2 times A. To get what's left in the parentheses, you will divide. I'm going to do that in my head. So dividing, that means I'm going to get an A plus 4B. Then I'm going to bring down my plus sign. Looking at the next grouping, I can see that there's a 3 in common. There's also a negative in common. So I'm going to not only take out a 3, but I'm going to take out a negative 3. Just to show you, if you took out a 3 and only a 3, you would be left with negative A minus 4B. This is not the same as this. So that means that would not be correct. So what you want to do is take out a negative 3, leaving you with A plus 4B. And now I can see that my parentheses are the same, which is exactly what you want. Okay, so taking out the common parentheses, A plus 4B, leaves behind the binomial 2A plus a negative 3 would just be minus 3. And then that is your answer. So some people often ask, how do I know when to take out a negative GCF? The sort of hint to know about taking out a negative with your GCF is if the first term is negative, then make your then the GCF is negative. So that's sort of the general rule of thumb that I go with. The other thing I do is I really make sure that when I'm doing these problems, that whenever I get my parentheses, I just make sure that my two parentheses are the same. If they are not the same, then you know you've done something wrong. Okay, so here is a second example for you to try. Okay, I want you to try this one on your own. Okay, so take a moment, press pause, and give this problem a try. Okay, so you should have had some time to practice this. So let me go ahead and do this one for you. So you should have grouped first two terms, plus sign, second two terms. Okay. Make sure that when you're grouping the terms that it's a plus sign in between. Pay attention to the last example that when I group the second two terms together, that negative that's part of 3a is included in that second group. So that's really important to remember. In doing this problem, your GCF of the first group is y squared, leaving you with y minus 9. The plus sign goes next. The GCF of the second group, the only thing they have in common is a 1. Now you have to put the 1 there because otherwise, when you go to complete the problem and find your two parentheses, you might be missing a term if you don't put that there. So if the GCF is 1, if the GCF is 1, factor it out. That goes for if it's a negative 1, same thing. Okay, so then we see here are my common parentheses. In the common parentheses, I am going to be taking out y minus 9, leaving behind a y squared plus 1. And then this would be your final answer. So what I was saying about the 1, if you did not take this one out, let's say that you didn't put that there, when you go to put your GCFs into a parenthesis to help create your two binomial factors, you might not have it there. And then this, if you were to multiply it back together, would not get you 4 terms. It would actually only give you the first 2 terms. So in order to make sure that your factors would multiply to these 4 terms, that's how many terms a binomial times a binomial gets you, you have to make sure that you take out GCFs of 1. Okay? And always and forever, remember that you can check your answer by multiplying. And I think I've mentioned this before, but just want to reemphasize that. And anytime you multiply 2 terms by 2 terms, you will always initially get 4 terms prior to any combining of like terms. Okay? So I hope that these couple of examples and these steps have helped you out. So if you like this video, hit like, subscribe to the channel to watch my other videos, and good luck with your practice.